Hello and welcome to Catholic Answers Live. I'm Cy Kellett, your host. So happy to be here with you. 2 hours with Jimmy Akin today. Come on, that's hard to beat on a Friday. We're so glad that you are here. But we're going to ask you not to call, just to sit back and enjoy listening because today we've got an internet open forum. All of our questions are coming from the internet. And so you don't have to call, and I'll probably make a mistake and give out the phone number. I tend to do that kind of thing. But I've got all the questions right here in front of me. My job will be to read them. Jimmy's job will be to answer them. And your job, we hope, will be to enjoy the program. So Jimmy Akin, of course, is senior apologist here at Catholic Answers, the proprietor of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World. Jimmy Akin, thank you for being with us.
Hello, Cyril Kellett. Glad to be here.
The internet's got a whole bunch of questions for you today, Jimmy. But today, being Friday, would be the day that Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World drops. And lately, we've been seeing a tremendous mix of very, very Christian and Catholic faith-based stuff, and lots of really good secular mysteries as well. Do you have an idea what mystery is dropping today?
Yeah, it's a patrons question show. So we every quarter we ask our patrons for what questions they'd like to have answered, and they bring up a bunch of different topics. So it's kind of like a mysterious version of an open forum, and so that's what's dropping today.
Very, very good. Well, we got a whole bunch of questions, Jimmy. How about we just dive right into them?
Let's do them.
All right, let's. Here's what Connor has to say. Connor asks this: if you were dying, could you relay your confession to another person and they tell it to a priest? Also, can you say a confession over the phone?
So, most of the sacraments, at least 5 of them, require personal presence. You can't, if you're going to baptize someone, the water has to come into contact with their skin. If you're going to receive communion, you have to receive it into your mouth. And so, with 5 of the sacraments, there is a clear requirement for personal presence. But there's one sacrament where the church does not require personal presence, and that is the sacrament of matrimony, because it is possible under church law to get married by proxy. And what happens in a marriage by proxy is at least one of the spouses, or possibly both of the spouses, delegate someone else to serve as their proxy and exchange matrimonial consent on their behalf. So you give information to the proxy, you give authorization to the proxy to act on your behalf, and then the proxy communicates that information in your name, namely, in this case, consent to be married. And the church acknowledges the validity of marriage by proxy. It's right there in the Code of Canon Law. And while the church's law does not address or its teaching does not address the sacrament of confession in this regard, it seems to me that in principle, if you have an information-based sacrament like matrimony, then the same principle in principle could apply to another information-based sacrament like confession, where you're communicating both what you did and your sorrow for it. Now, the law does not provide for making your confession through another person, but I don't see a reason why, if we accept marriage by proxy, it wouldn't be possible in principle to do confession by proxy either. Also, so that would be my answer to the first question. The second question: can you say a confession over the phone? There's no specific teaching on this, and the Code of Canon Law does not address it. You will find theologians who say, well, you don't have personal presence in that case, but and therefore it wouldn't be valid. But you'll also find theologians, including some older ones, like Henry Davis, who was a Jesuit in the 1930s. He wrote a big 4-volume set on moral and pastoral theology. And he was of the opinion that you could, because again, this is an information-based sacrament. And so you could communicate the needed information over the phone and be absolved over the phone in Henry Davis's view. That really is a little frightening. I mean, to think about, given that in the 1930s there were lots of party lines where other people
Yeah, that's right.
could be listening to your conversation over the
Right.
phone. And today, we have government intelligence agencies that are scooping up everything that is said over phone systems. So there are some privacy concerns here. But the church has no teaching on this, and I can't rule it out that it would be valid in principle. If I were in the process of having a heart attack or something like that and was going to die within the next few minutes or likely to die within the next few minutes, I would give it a try on the hopes that it works. Assuming I have a priest who would cooperate. And because of the doubt in this situation about whether it would be valid, it seems to me that it would be appropriate to make a conditional absolution. Something like the formula, if it's possible, I absolve you of your sins. Just like we would make conditional baptisms in the case of doubt about whether a previous baptism was valid.
Ah, yes. Yeah, that privacy thing is a serious concern, but that's interesting. So, in many ways, we're still in the place of a lot of theological speculation on this. There's not a firm, final, absolutely no, absolutely yes.
Yeah, it's something that the church simply has not authoritatively addressed so far as I've been able to determine. But I definitely would not want to say confession over a party line. And that was a big thing. I don't know if you ever listened to old time radio,
Oh, yeah.
but there was an old time radio program called Lum and Abner, which was set. It was a comedy show. It was set in rural Arkansas, and at the beginning of every episode, a phone rings, and Abner says, "That's our ring, Lum," and that means the phone has just used the ring on the party line for their store.
Yeah.
But anybody on that party line, I
Could
think
pick it
it's
up.
Pine Grove is the fictional city where it said anyone in Pine Grove could pick up the phone and listen.
Yes. So you can that's a fodder for comedy there. Yeah, because they're just running a line down a street basically, and everybody on the street, especially, yeah, if you're all on the same line, anybody can pick up and listen to what's going on.
Yeah.
Uh,
Pine
all right.
Ridge is where it is.
Thank you very much for the question, Connor. Appreciate it. Jimmy Akin is our guest. It's an internet open forum today, and this one comes from Paul. Is there any evidence for or against St. Thomas evangelizing India?
So the book that I recommend on this subject is a recent one. It's by Sean McDowell, and it's called "The Fate of the Apostles." And what he does in this is it's a scholarly level work, and it's a little bit more expensive, but he goes through basically all of the evidence we have from the early church regarding what happened to the apostles after after what's recorded in the New Testament, and the picture is clear for about 4 or 5 of the apostles. We know what happened to Peter and Paul and James the Just, because he's actually killed in the New Testament. And also, we know what happened. I'm sorry, James, son of Zebedee, is killed in the New Testament. And then James the Just, Jesus's so-called brother, we also know what happened to him. But after that, it starts getting unclear. Thomas, some of the apostles we have very little information on, and we really don't know what happened to them. In the
Mhm.
case of Thomas, though, he's kind of in the middle. We have some early evidence regarding Thomas. It's not conclusive, but in the Fate of the Apostles, McDowell develops 2 propositions about Thomas. One is that he traveled to India, and the second is that he was martyred. And he judges, in the end, after reviewing all the early church evidence, he judges both of them as more probable than not. So there is some evidence in the case of Thomas traveling to India. That's something that's mentioned in the Acts of Thomas, in the Didascalia Apostolorum, in a work by the 3rd century Church Father Hippolytus on the 12. It's also in Origen's commentary on Genesis, and in a few other places, as well as traditions of the so-called Thomas Christians in India. You also have evidence for his martyrdom in the Acts of Thomas and some early church fathers beginning in the 3rd century, and there's a lack of a competing tradition, so he also judges his martyrdom as more probable than not.
Okay. All right. And that the name of that book, if it's a scholarly book, you said more expensive, but it was called The Fate of the Apostles, if someone wanted to look in that.
By Sean McDowell, yes.
By Sean McDowell. Okay, that brings us to the break, and we'll take that break and come right back with more Internet Open Forum with Jimmy Akin on Catholic Answers Live.
Catch Catholic Answers Live anytime at Catholic.com.
Underwriting for Catholic Answers Live is provided by Real Estate for Life. Real Estate for Life connects home buyers and sellers to real estate agents while supporting pro-life organizations. On the web at realestateforlife.org.
Are you a coffee drinker? If so, you can now enjoy a coffee roasted to perfection by the Carmelite monks of Wyoming. Delicious Mystic Monk coffee is roasted and prepared by monks in a hidden cloistered monastery and is available in over 25 varieties. All Mystic Monk coffees are works of perfection and labors of love. For more information on how to purchase Mystic Monk coffee, visit mysticmonkcoffee.com. That's mysticmonkcoffee.com.
EWTN, communicating the faith.
My wife is Catholic, my mother's Catholic, and I went to a weekend retreat to get married in the church. And I was just getting confused about what steps you need to take to be baptized, because I'm willing to do that. My wife does go to church regularly, and I need to.
Sure, I can help you. The easiest thing to do is to call the parish and tell them you'd like to become Catholic and you'd like to be baptized. They'll fix you up from there.
Welcome back to Catholic Answers Live. I'm Cy Kellett, your host. Jimmy Akin is our guest. And it's an Internet Open Forum, and I really enjoy the Internet Open Forum. Oftentimes, it gives us a chance to answer questions that don't make it on the air. They're often very thoughtful questions, as a matter of fact, that don't fall into the usual category of calls we get on the air. And here's one of them. I've been really looking forward to hear what you had to say about this one, Jimmy. And I don't remember ever having been asked this on the air. Dan asks, what would the Mass look like if the reforms of Vatican II were faithfully implemented?
So the question is a little bit contentious, because but if we rephrase it a little bit and say, what would the Mass look like if exactly what the Council Fathers had called for were implemented? We can answer that. I don't want us, the liturgy is itself something that develops over time. And so after that Second Vatican Council, the Vatican started getting a bunch of requests from bishops around the world for things. And I wouldn't view those requests as being illegitimate.
Right. Okay.
You could say maybe they were well advised, maybe they were not so well advised, but I wouldn't consider them illegitimate to make a request and then have the congregation that developed the current rite of the Mass, evaluate them. I wouldn't view that as an illegitimate process. But there is an article that was published last year in Catholic World Report by Father Joseph Fessio, and it's called The Mass of Vatican II, and so you can look that up online, just Joseph Fessio, The Mass of Vatican II. You can throw in Catholic World Report if you want, and he summarizes it. He goes through the key paragraphs in Sacrosanctum Concilium, which was the Second Vatican Council document on the liturgy, and he talks about what the Fathers called for, and then he also talks about what they did not call for. And so relying on his summary, things that the council proposed included a simplification of the liturgy and a removal of things that had been duplicated over the years or added over the years, but that weren't really advantageous. So they called for some kind of simplification, but they didn't have a lot of detail about exactly what should be simplified. They also called for a greater selection of scripture readings, because at the time there was just one cycle of readings for the year, and there was only 1 year of readings. So you had a very limited selection of scripture passages in the readings. And so this request is the origin of the current system, where we have 3 cycles of Sunday and Holy Day readings based on the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And then we have 2 weekday cycles. And it doesn't let us get the whole Bible in, but it lets us get a lot more of it in. So that was faithfully executed. They also called for good homilies. And okay, I'll let you make your own judgment call on that, but that's not really part of the rite of the liturgy. It's not part of, it'll say in the rite, homily goes here, but it doesn't tell you how to make it good. Although I think there could be some additional guidance provided on that. I don't know why, for example, priests want to begin their homilies with a story of dubious historicity that serves as kind of a parable to set up the homily. I don't know why they do that. Look, Jesus was good at telling parables. Just tell me what Jesus said. Don't make up your own parable. It won't be as good.
Good homily.
But that's just my view. Yeah. They also called for some use of the vernacular. Now, of course, here, all of these apply to the liturgy of the Latin Rite, not other rites. But they called for limited use of the vernacular, for example, in the readings and in the parts of the faithful, including the common prayers, but not other fixed parts of the Mass, which were still to be in Latin, the way the Council Fathers envisioned it. And this is one of those areas where after the Council, the congregation that was revising all this got a lot of requests for even more use of the vernacular from bishops around the world, and that's why we ended up with a largely completely vernacular Mass. They called for hosts to be distributed to the extent possible that had been consecrated at the same Mass. And that's been implemented. You can't always do that because you never know exactly how many people you're going to have at a Mass, but they didn't want the priest just consecrating one host for himself and everybody else's host comes out of a tabernacle.
Right. Okay.
They called for a limited use of communion under both kinds. So they didn't call for the extensive use of communion under both kinds that we have today, but they did call for a limited use of it. They also called for both the Liturgy of the Word, what we now call the Liturgy of the Word, and the Liturgy of the Eucharist to be considered essential components of the Mass. So back in the day, it was considered sufficient if you just showed up for the Liturgy of the Eucharist and skipped the Liturgy of the Word. And they said, we don't want that. We want the faithful to be there for both parts.
I didn't know that was innovation or kind of a new emphasis that before people. So that's where the old idea of as long as you show up. No, that wouldn't even include. I guess I was taught show up for the gospel and you're all right. But So you just had to show up for the Liturgy of the Eucharist.
Right. They wanted them both considered essential, important parts of the Mass. And they also called for the practice to be allowed of concelebration, which was something the Eastern rites of the Church had already been doing, and now they wanted to do it in the Latin Rite as well. So those were the things the Council Fathers called for. The things they did not call for include the abolition of chant at Mass. In fact, Vatican II specifically calls for Gregorian chant, meaning chanting the text of the Mass. We're not talking about the hymns, but chanting the text of the Mass in the Gregorian way was preferred by the Council Fathers. So they didn't call for the abolition of chanting the Mass. They did not call for tabernacles to be moved. They did not call for the priest to spend the entire Mass facing the people instead of facing east as their representative. They didn't call for the complete abolition of Latin. In fact, they said they wanted some Latin to remain. And I've seen a lot of the masses that I've seen in recent years have gone back to that and have included some actual Latin, in hymns and other things that the faithful can say together. They did not call for multiple Eucharistic prayers. They envisioned what is now called Eucharistic Prayer 1, which is known as the Roman canon. That was still to be the canon of the Roman Rite. It might be simplified or updated in some way, but they didn't call for the multiple Eucharistic prayers that we have now. They also didn't call for the removal of altar rails, and they didn't call for communion in the hand. Now, that doesn't mean that bishops can't request all the things they didn't call for, but if we're talking about just what the Council Fathers said, they didn't ask for any of those things.
Dan, I'm very grateful for that question. Maybe we can make a link to the Catholic World Report article in the show notes, and people can find it there. Thank you, Dan, very much for that. Moving on with our internet open forum, Jimmy Akin, our guest. I go to Alicia now. Alicia asks this: how does remote cooperation with evil get defined? And how does it apply to using the benefits of medical research?
Okay, so there are two questions there. The first one, how does it get defined, is a little tricky because I did a study of this some years ago, and there is no, I'm going to use a Latin term, but there's no locus classicus giving a definition. A locus classicus is the typical place or the classic place you would go for an explanation of a concept. And if you look in the Catechism, or you look in the Code of Canon Law, or you look in the writings of popes, there isn't one on cooperation with evil. Where this gets defined is in the writings of moral theologians, but there's no single source that everybody agrees on. It's kind of like, like with the definition of law, there's a locus classicus in Thomas Aquinas you can look up, where he gives the standard definition of what a law is. But there isn't a place where everyone agrees this is the classic explanation of remote cooperation with evil. And so it gets understood a little bit differently among different theologians. But one of the things that helps make a cooperation with evil remote is the interposition of another moral agent between you and whatever is going on. So you're not directly participating in the act. There's another person, another moral agent that is closer to the evil that's being committed than you are. So that seems to be a kind of minimum requirement for cooperation to be remote. If you were doing the evil yourself, you're not remote from it. So you need at least one other person between you and the evil. In terms of the second question, how does it apply to the benefits of medical research? We need to distinguish between surgical and non-surgical procedures. In the case of non-surgical procedures, like taking a pill or taking an injection or obtaining a diagnosis, even if someone did evil to make this possible, it's usually remote. In fact, it would almost invariably be remote cooperation with that evil for you to take a pill or you to take an injection or you to get a diagnosis. On the other hand, there are surgical procedures, and some surgical procedures are themselves evil, like abortion or sterilization. So generally, and there's no way to have a remote abortion or to be sterilized remotely. So remote cooperation with evil will tend to apply to non-surgical procedures, but it won't apply to surgical procedures, and you have to look more closely at, is this surgery intrinsically evil or not?
Okay. All right. Alicia,
but generally, you can justify non-surgical procedures on the grounds of it's only remote cooperation with evil, and there's a counterbalancing benefit.
Again, Alicia, thank you very, very much for the question. The next one comes from Janet. Jimmy, I'll give it to you, and we'll see how much we can get in before the break. Janet asks, I would love to know exactly how the early church knew that Mary had been assumed into heaven. Is there a gospel somewhere, small g, because it's not in the canon of scripture, that attests to it? I believe it. I just would love to hear where it was written down, what happened, and how everyone reacted, kind of like the ascension narrative.
So you're right. There's no discussion of Mary's assumption in the Bible. Some people will argue that Revelation 12, with the image of the woman in heaven, may reflect Mary's assumption, but that's not clear because she may have simply been still alive at the time. And the woman has more than one meaning, so it doesn't automatically tell us about the assumption. But I'll tell you where in the early church we do have discussions of the assumption on the other side of the break.
Janet, thanks for the question. We will do that on the other side of the break. It's an internet open forum. All the questions came from the various means the internet has to get them to us. And Jimmy Akin is here to answer them. We'll continue that right after this on Catholic Answers Live.
Catholic Answers Live. Here's a question. Is it really possible to be friends with someone who died 2,000 years ago? Maybe the problem is that we've grown way too comfortable with the story of Jesus. Nice man, right? Taught us to love one another, said not to judge people. We celebrate his birthday every year. It's time to put away this small, safe version of Jesus, says Cy Kellett. Nobody that bland could have transformed the world. In A Teacher of Strange Things, Cy presents Jesus Christ undiluted by sentiment, with all his radical words and deeds uncensored. Do you know someone, your son or daughter perhaps, or maybe your mom or dad, who needs the friendship of Jesus Christ? Do you? Order your copy of A Teacher of Strange Things by visiting shop.catholic.com today or asking for it at a good Catholic bookstore near you.
Can you defend the Church's teaching on the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist? Do you desire a deeper relationship with our Lord in the Blessed Sacrament? Join us September 22nd through 25th for the annual Catholic Answers Conference in San Diego. This year's theme is the Eucharist, I Am With You Always. Featuring all the Catholic Answers speakers and special guest Bishop Thomas Paprocki, use promo code EARLY to save $50 when you register at CatholicAnswersConference.com.
Want to know more about the origins of the Catholic Church? Joe Heschmeyer explores the beginnings of Christianity in The Early Church Was the Catholic Church. Joe digs deep into the words and actions of those who lived right after the apostles to refute anti-Catholic claims of how the faith was lived back then. Order your copy of The Early Church Was the Catholic Church today at shop.catholic.com or get it at a good Catholic bookstore near you.
Welcome back to Catholic Answers Live. I'm Cy Kellett, your host. Jimmy Akin is our guest, and Jimmy will be with us both hours. So a lot of fun to be had yet as we get questions from the internet. Lots of internet questions lined up for Jimmy. Right now, Jimmy's was in the beginning stages of answering Janet's question about how we know about the Assumption of Mary. Jimmy?
Yeah, I was more in the midpoint of answering, okay. But here's the other half. So in 1997, John Paul II gave a catechesis in which he discussed the Assumption of Mary and the historical evidence for it. And he refers to a collection of apocryphal stories that are known as the Transitus Mariae, which is Latin for the transit of Mary. These are also called transitus stories. And what he said was this: the first trace of belief in the Virgin's Assumption can be found in the apocryphal accounts entitled Transitus Mariae, whose origin dates to the 2nd and 3rd centuries. So that's the AD 100s and 200s. These are popular and sometimes romanticized depictions, which in this case, however, pick up an intuition of faith on the part of God's people. So based on the scholars assisting John Paul II in composing his catecheses, it it would appear that they date the Transitus stories to the AD 100s and 200s. And yes, there are these apocryphal accounts. I've read some of them, and there are different editions of them, but that's the earliest discussion we have in an explicit way of Mary's Assumption.
All right. Thanks, Janet. Thanks very, very much for the question. Let's go to Eric's question. Eric asked this. After St. Peter died, what were the relative levels of authority between the subsequent popes and the remaining apostles? Eric, thank you.
Well, the answer is unclear. We are dealing with a period in church history that was a transitional one between the age of the apostles and the post-apostolic age. And we have almost no information about this period. There were very few works that were written in this period, if any, and certainly not higher level works. I mean, we have things like the Odes of Solomon, which is a Christian hymn book from around the year AD 100, but it's a hymn book. It's not a theological treatise, and it's certainly not a treatise on ecclesiology, which is the study of the church, and that would really be what category this question falls in. So we really don't have a lot of information. It seems that some of the apostles did survive Peter. We know Peter died probably in AD 65 or 66. And we know St. Paul, it appears that St. Paul survived him because it looks like St. Paul died in AD 67. And presumably others did as well. But we don't have a lot of information about this period. And the apostles, by this point, were scattered. So it's not like they were necessarily in communication with each other. And as a result, they were probably largely doing their own thing in whatever region they were in. And they would have retained their authority as apostles. So they could have, for example, continued to receive divine revelation, which public revelation, which would be binding on people. And that actually could have applied to the Pope too, because the definition of apostle is a little bit fuzzy, and there are individuals who seem to be referred to as apostles in the New Testament that are not members of the 12. And there certainly are who are not members of the 12, but there are more than you'd think. And so if we're talking about the apostolic age, we kind of got to be prepared for there to be more apostles than we typically imagine. And they would have retained whatever authority they had. What was unique about Peter and his successor is he had a special role that included the full exercise of the keys and the ability to infallibly define teaching. And the successor of Peter, and he also had power of jurisdiction, but the power of jurisdiction, which falls under the power of the keys, is going to be kind of hard to exercise when you're not in communication with each other. So like we talked about Thomas, there's evidence Thomas was way over in India. Well, okay, he's not going to be in regular communication with whoever's in Rome. He likely wouldn't have even known about Peter's death, when it occurred.
Yeah.
So the apostles are largely functioning autonomously, and it took time for the church to grow to the point that it was in regular communication with each other, and the power of jurisdiction on the Pope's part to come into force and develop and so forth. So it's a transitional period. It didn't last very long, just a few decades, and we really don't have a lot of information about it. So we have to be kind of careful and, reserved in what we envision about it. We can envision different ways it could work, but we really don't have firm evidence of exactly how it worked.
Eric, thank you very much for that question. I hope that was a helpful answer to you. We got lots and lots of internet open forum questions for Jimmy. And on we go to this question from Maria. Maria asks, if through Adam's sin, we all inherit original sin, and if Jesus is the new Adam, why do all of us after Jesus's time, who are children of baptized people, still inherit original sin?
Because Jesus is not identically parallel to Adam in every respect. Adam's original sin made a heritable change in human nature such that we could no longer pass on to our offspring sanctifying grace through the act of begetting them. Jesus's redemption did not make a heritable change in human nature. So the fact that you're a Christian and you're in a state of sanctifying grace, you still can't pass on that sanctifying grace to your offspring by begetting them. So we know that's a fact. We can then speculate on why God chose to set it up that way. One speculation would be to connect it with free will and say, well, God wants everyone to freely choose to love him. And so God does not just have us born immaculate. He'll make us immaculate in the end, but he doesn't have us just born that way. On the other hand, that's not a fully satisfying explanation, because just because you're born immaculate doesn't mean you can't choose sin. You can still freely, I mean, look at Adam and Eve. They were created immaculate, they were born immaculate, and they still chose sin. So this isn't a fully satisfying answer, and we kind of have to leave it. We know it's the case that the consequences of their act was heritable. It can be passed on to offspring, whereas Jesus's was not. But beyond that, there's a considerable element of mystery here, and we can only speculate.
Thanks again for the question, Maria. Appreciate it. This one comes from Jonathan. How do we know and explain that the Catechism doesn't contradict prior church teaching about there being no salvation outside of the Catholic Church?
Well, the Catechism teaches no salvation outside of the Church, but it then goes on to explain what it understands that to mean. And it does contradict a common understanding of extra ecclesiam nullis alice, or no salvation outside the church, because a lot of people in the past took it more absolutely than the Catechism does. What we see in the interim is a process of doctrinal development that clarified the nature of extra ecclesiam nullis alice, or no salvation outside the church. And, doctrinal development is to be expected. Over the course of centuries, things get clarified as the Holy Spirit leads the church into a fuller, more precise understanding of the deposit of faith. And even in the Middle Ages, extra ecclesiam nullis alice, I keep using the Latin phrase for it because that's how I think of it, was not absolute. You can go back, for example, to St. Augustine, and he'll talk about how catechumens can be saved. And catechumens are people who are not yet Christian, they're not yet baptized, but they plan to be, they intend to be, and classically the church would say, okay, they're saved, even though they're not formally members of the church, they do receive God's grace. And so you have to incorporate that realization, which dates from the age of the fathers, to however you're going to understand no salvation outside the church. Even though these people are outside the church in a sense, they're also united to the church in another sense. The same understanding was endorsed by the Council of Trent, which said that you couldn't be saved without the sacraments or the desire of them, which is what catechumens have. They desire and intend to be baptized. And so, yeah, I don't know if you could hear that, but my Alexa was just telling me something. They have the desire and intent to be baptized, and so they have the desire of the sacraments, or what's sometimes called baptism of desire. Well, the church, after the discovery of the New World, suddenly realized, during the age of exploration, wait, there are millions of people who have never even heard about God. They have never had the chance to respond to the gospel. Would a loving God really send all of those people to hell without exception? And as theologians meditated on that fact, they concluded the answer was no, that there were good people who had never heard the gospel, and God wasn't simply going to damn those people. They appeared to be, acting in good faith. They didn't reject the gospel through any fault of their own, and they were otherwise living lives of virtue that signaled that they were cooperating with the grace God gave them. And so by the 19th century, it was understood that the desire for the sacraments could be something implicit, such that if you knew that God wants you to be baptized, then you would get baptized. And you find Pope Pius IX talking about the possibility of salvation for people who are through no fault of their own not Catholic. He did this actually, he's famous for defining the Immaculate Conception. And I think it's the day after he defined the Immaculate Conception, he had a meeting with world bishops where he talked about the possibility of salvation for non-Catholics. You had the same thing happen in the 1940s, where there was a controversy here in America with a priest named Father Leonard Feeney, who had a very restrictive understanding of no salvation outside the church, and he accused the Archbishop of Boston of heresy, which got the Holy Office or the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith involved. And they wrote a response in which they said that, yes, it is possible for people to have a kind of implicit desire for the sacraments, and that's essentially the position that was articulated at Vatican II. So, and then the Catechism quotes from Vatican II on this subject. So the Catechism and Vatican II do reject an understanding, a restrictive understanding of no salvation outside the church. But even going back to the patristic age, it was never understood that you absolutely have to be a baptized Catholic in order to be saved. And things like the discovery of the New World and the theological reflection that occurred after that led the church to more clearly perceive what the core truth is here. And the core truth is that if you knowingly and deliberately reject God's church, you won't be saved. But there are lots of people who don't knowingly and deliberately reject it. They may be in good faith and otherwise striving to live a good life in accordance with God's grace, and that establishes a connection between them and the church that makes it possible for them to be saved.
Jonathan, what a great question. Thank you very much for that. We've got lots more questions from the internet for Jimmy Akin. Internet Open Forum with Jimmy Akin on Catholic Answers Live will continue right after this.
This is Archbishop Paul Coakley, the Archdiocese of Oklahoma City, and you're listening to Catholic Answers Live.
Do you love praying for people? Have you ever wanted to use your gift of prayer to share Jesus with others and build up the body of Christ? Start a public prayer station with St. Paul Street Evangelization. Listen to people's needs, pray with them, or invite them to meet you at church. St. Paul Street Evangelization can help you get started. Find out how at streetevangelization.com. That's streetevangelization.com.
One of the reasons we should go to Mass is because it is the food of the saints that we receive. And for the saints, they understood rightly that the time after Holy Communion, that those moments are the most precious moments of our lives.
The Holy Sacrifice of the Mass, live from the EWTN Chapel, every morning, 8 Eastern, on EWTN Radio and Television.
Welcome back. Catholic Answers Live. I'm Cy Kellett, your host. Jimmy Akin, our guest, and it's Internet Open Forum. Lots of great questions from the internet. Harold asked this one. In the book, 10 Popes Who Shook the World, Eamon Duffy wrote, the most famous of Eamon Duffy wrote, the most famous of all papal texts, Matthew 16:18. You are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven is quoted in no Roman source before the time of the Decian persecution in the middle of the 3rd century. And the very roots of what may be called the foundation myth of the papacy are uncomfortably complicated. True or not, what makes a Roman source definitive, and what is the earliest best source for this passage?
So I'll get to the question, but in just hearing the quotation from the historian Eamon Duffy, my reaction is, so what? Even if that's true, who cares? This is an argument from silence that he's making. He says that that no Roman source mentions this before the Decian persecution in the middle of the 3rd century. Okay, so that's the AD 250s. Do you know how much literature we have from all of Christianity from before the year 250? Not a lot.
No,
Do you know how much Christian literature we have from Roman sources before 250? Even less. So this is an argument from silence that doesn't carry a lot of weight, because arguments from silence are notoriously weak, because absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, as they say. And just because we have lost almost all of the Christian literature from this period doesn't mean that Christians in this period didn't have the idea that that there's a successor of Peter. It just means that we don't have a record of it because we have so little literature from this period. But to get to the question, what makes a Roman source definitive? Well, if it depends on what you mean by definitive, but if you mean, if you mean infallible or even just highly authoritative, it's going to be the Pope himself. He's the one with the authority. He's the one that can exercise infallibility. And so it would be, if by definitive Roman source, well, that would be a Pope. But you can also interpret Roman source more broadly. And even if it were true that people hadn't worked out the connections between this text and Peter's successor, that wouldn't stop this text from having implications for Peter's successor. So I think this is a really bad argument. In terms of the sources we have, I checked Dinsinger's Enchiridion Symbolorum. Dinsinger is a commonly used textbook of authoritative sources of information on Christian doctrine. It typically is quoting popes and ecumenical councils. And in Dinsinger, I looked to see how many popes were there from before the 250s that are even in Dinsinger. And there's two. There's just two passages. One of them is one of the popes is Clement I, and he wrote a famous letter to the Corinthians that's from the end of the 1st century. It probably dates to the first half of the year AD 70. And then there was a second pope quite a bit later on named Zephyrinus. And so we really only have two sources from popes from this period. On the other hand, we do have some other sources from this period. Tatian the Syrian, who spent some time in Rome, so you could consider him a Roman source, around the year 170, linked this passage to Matthew 16:18, to the successor of Peter. And so that's 170. That's well before the Decian persecution in the mid-200s. Also, the North African author Tertullian, writing around the year 200. So again, this is 50 years before the time period that Duffy is talking about. On multiple occasions, links Matthew 16:18 to the successor of Peter. And Origen, the early Christian author Origen, around 250, around 249 actually, does the same thing. So even though these aren't Roman sources, we see clear evidence for Christians in this period linking Matthew 16:18 to the Pope. And so this reveals to my mind just how ad hoc and artificial Eamon Duffy's argument is. He's unduly narrowly restricted the scope to just Roman sources, as if those were the only ones that were important.
Yeah, that seems less than comprehensive as far as a historian's work goes.
It seems a little duplicitous, in fact.
Yeah. Harold, great question. Thank you very, very much. Appreciate that. It's internet open forum. Jimmy Akin is our guest. Brett asks this, Jimmy. Why do we kneel for prayer during Mass and yet we stand for the Lord's Prayer?
Well, we don't kneel during Mass all that much. In the official Roman Missal, there's really only one place where it calls for kneeling, and that's at the consecration. Here in America, the bishops petitioned to have a second instance of kneeling years ago, and the Vatican approved it. So here in America, we actually kneel twice during Mass, but worldwide in the Latin Rite, it's just once, and that's just for the consecration. But there's kind of a general principle at Mass. There may be exceptions, but in general, we sit in order to listen. So like we're sitting for the scripture readings and so forth, except for the gospel. We stand to pray, and that would include the Lord's Prayer. And also hymns are a form of prayer, so we stand for them too. And then we kneel for the Eucharist. So sit to listen, stand to pray, kneel for the Eucharist, and that's why we stand for the Lord's Prayer.
Thanks, Brett. Appreciate that question. I'm not sure. Are we taking baseball questions? I guess we'll try Francisco's question. Jimmy, was Moe Berg really a spy?
So, yeah, Moe Berg was a sports ball player in the first half of the 20th century, and his particular form of sports ball, I gather, is what is known as baseball. Baseball, yeah.
Present tense, Jimmy.
Yeah, okay. And he played for teams like the Red Sox and the White Sox and several others as well. Yep. And yes, he was a spy during World War II and after. But during World War II, he worked for the OSS, which was the predecessor of the CIA. The CIA wasn't formed until after the war. But during World War II, he worked for the Office of Special Services, or OSS, and he did intelligence work for them. He was a spy. I find one particular story about him fascinating. At one point, he was sent to attend a lecture. This was in 1944. He was sent to attend a lecture by the German physicist Werner Heisenberg. And his assignment was to listen to Heisenberg's speech and determine from what Heisenberg said whether the Nazis were close to developing an atomic bomb.
Wow.
And this is a really interesting thing, because it means that Moe Berg must have been briefed not only about the atomic bomb, which was highly classified at the time, because we were working on it with the Manhattan Project, and all that was very classified. So not only did they have to tell Moe Berg about the atomic bomb that we're working on it, they also had to tell him enough about how an atomic bomb worked to be able to tell from listening to Heisenberg whether the Germans were as advanced as we were in building one.
Yeah.
And so he must have known a considerable amount, not just that that we were working on it, but here's how it would work. And his assignment, if he determined that that based on what Heisenberg said in his speech, that the Germans were close to building a bomb, he was to shoot Heisenberg. He was to just assassinate him. Wow. And he determined, listening to Heisenberg, they're not close. And so Heisenberg lived another day.
Wow. Well, that's a remarkable answer, because Jimmy answered a question about a professional baseball player, which is remarkable in itself. But what an odd thing, Mo Berg. What an odd and interesting story. Jimmy, thanks. We'll continue with Internet Open Forum. Next hour, Jimmy will stay with us. Lots more great questions. Can't guarantee they're about the possible assassination of major scientists, but they'll be interesting. I can tell you that. We'll see you then right after this on Catholic Answers Live. Welcome back to Catholic Answers Live. Thanks for being with us on this Friday afternoon. Jimmy Akin with us as well. We're doing an internet open forum. All of our questions are already typed out and in front of us because we've received them via the internet and collected them up to do this program with you. Jimmy, of course, senior apologist at Catholic Answers, the author of a whole bunch of things, including books that you regularly hear us give away here on the air. The Bible is a Catholic book, A Daily Defense, 365 Days plus one to Becoming a Better Apologist, and a new book that we've been giving away a whole lot, which is The Words of Eternal Life, True Happiness, and Where to Find It. Jimmy, thanks for being back for another hour.
Yeah, my pleasure.
That was a fascinating little story about Mo. I'm really glad we got that Mo Berg question there at the end. That was a fascinating little story. Did Heisenberg survive the war? Did he go on to have a career? Yeah. All right.
Yeah.
All right.
It was a little uncertain for a while, but yes, he survived.
It was a little uncertain for a while because of.
It's just a joke.
Heisenberg's
uncertainty principle is what he's famous for.
Come on, I should have gotten that. That was a good joke too.
Little physics joke there, yeah.
All right, let's go back to more questions. Celine asks this. She says, a family member with dementia has me thinking a lot about this. Say you're a Catholic, and maybe you haven't been the most charitable or loving, but you do your basic duty of Mass and confession. Dementia creeps up, either slowly or quickly, and you get to the point where you don't know what day it is, much less are able to make an examination of conscience for confession. I just wonder about the state of the soul that can't improve or offer things up. I know you're not responsible for your actions if you're not in your right mind, but do you think they can gain any merit just for the trial of what they're going through?
Well, okay, so we want to distinguish between gaining merit and other things that can happen when one is suffering. In order to gain merit, you have to have the intention to please God and do good. And it doesn't have to be an intention you're consciously thinking about at the moment that you do good. It can be what's called a virtual intention, meaning something that you set for yourself and at some point in the past, and even if you're not currently thinking about it, you're acting consistent with your intention. And so if prior to the loss of the ability to make human decisions, or if during a moment of lucidity, even after dementia has become advanced enough that you're no longer making human decisions, you have a moment of lucidity and you set your intention to please God and do good, then that intention will remain even once you're no longer lucid. And so any good you do, including trying to deal with the dementia itself, which is a form of suffering, any dealing with it that you do in a good way is something that God would reward. And that's all merit is, I mean, we don't earn anything from God. Everything we have comes from him, but he does reward us when we do his will. And that's all the term merit means. Latin is meritum is the Latin term for reward. So the doctrine of merit is just the doctrine of rewards. And if a person has, even a subconscious intention to please God by doing good, and then they do some good, like how they handle their difficult situation with the dementia, then that is something God would reward. So it would be quote unquote meritorious. There are also other things that, and I should say, most Christians should have, just as part of the Christian life, the intention to please God by doing good. That's just part of the Christian mindset. So if you're a faithful Catholic who goes to Mass and confession before you're demented, then you probably have that intention, because it's just a normal part of the Christian mindset. Christians want to please God by doing good. There are other things that can happen too, though, with suffering, like we can deal with, by suffering various things, we can deal with the consequences of our sins. And so even if you didn't have the intention required to merit something, God could still use the suffering caused by the dementia to help purify you, and you might not have as long to spend in purgatory.
Celine, thank you. I'm sorry that that's a personal experience that you're going through, but thank you very much for the question. This one comes from Dawn. Any thoughts or ideas about when the Great Pyramid was built? Some say 4000 BC, but others claim 10,000 BC is more like it, even pre-flood. And then I think this is a different question. Were its air shafts would then point to a different excuse me, what is the second question there, Jimmy? Where its air shaft would then point to a different star?
I don't know that it's a second question, but it's the claim is that so coming out of the King's Chamber and the Queen's Chamber in the Great Pyramid, they have these shafts that apparently were put there for allowing air into the structure at a certain stage of its building. And although that's debated, there are other proposed uses for them, but they're called air shafts. And some alternative Egyptologists have proposed that the air shafts are at an angle that would point to significant stars, depending on when the pyramid was built. And so they might, for example, have been channels through which the pharaoh's soul could be launched to a significant star.
I got you.
So, I try to take every position open-mindedly, and so I'm open to the idea that something like the pyramid could have been built 10,000 BC or 12,000 years ago. We have other things from that period that display remarkable skill in building that are, fairly large. Like there's a site in Turkey known as Göbekli Tepe, which is a ceremonial site that is quite advanced for 12,000 years ago. That's the Neolithic period. And nevertheless, Göbekli Tepe is quite impressive. And so I wouldn't say it's impossible for people in 10,000 BC to have built something like the pyramids. The question is, what evidence do we have? And there are alternative Egyptologists who will argue that that's when the pyramids and the Sphinx were built. Conventional or mainstream Egyptology dates them to at least the Giza pyramids that are right there by Cairo, the famous ones. It dates them to 2500 BC. Or 4,500 years ago. And so in doing an open-minded look at the evidence for this, I ended up with the conclusion that conventional Egyptology is correct, that there is evidence in the Great Pyramid itself that confirms that the pharaoh who built it was Khufu, or to use his Greek name, Cheops. And one of the evidences for that is, so there are three main chambers that we've discovered in the Great Pyramid. There are probably others. We have some evidence that there are other large spaces in the Great Pyramid that we haven't opened up yet. But there are three that we've opened up. There's one that's actually in the bedrock under the pyramid that looks like it might have been a burial chamber that they abandoned and then decided to build higher up because Khufu was living long enough they could afford to do that. And so there's a second burial chamber called the Queen's Chamber. It really has no connection with the Queen, but it looks like it would have been Cheops's burial chamber if he died in sort of the middle of his reign. And then there's an upper one called the King's Chamber, which is because he lived even longer. And so they built this upper one, and they have in the King's and Queen's Chamber, they have these slanted roofs where you have two, big planes made out of stone coming together. And the problem was you've got so much weight on top of them that the chamber would be at risk of collapsing. The roof slabs were cracked. And so what the pyramid builders did was they built relieving chambers above the king's chamber, to take the stress off of the roof so that it wouldn't just crack and collapse and destroy the pharaoh's resting place or potential resting place. And after we discovered these relieving chambers, they were explored by an archaeologist named Harold Weiss. And when Harold Weiss went into them, he found graffiti that was on the rocks from the building of the pyramid. And the rocks, the big stones that the relieving chambers are made out of, had red paint on them. And among the things that the graffiti had was the name of Khufu. In fact, the one of them is like the name of the labor group that worked with these blocks. They were called the Companions of Khufu. And now some people then accused, in the alternative Egyptology community, accused Weiss of having faked this. They'll say he forged this. But there are a couple of reasons why that's not the case. One of them, or that we can show it's not the case, one of them is pharaohs didn't have just one name. They have one that they're famous by today, but they actually had 5 different throne names. Like there is one that's the Horus name, and there's another that they have these 5 different names. And at the time that Weiss discovered this graffiti, we didn't know all of Khufu's names, but now we do. And one of the other names is also there in the graffiti. So this is information that Weiss did not have access to because that name had not been discovered yet. And yet it's there, and yet it's there in the graffiti. Also, the way the graffiti is positioned, if you study it carefully, you realize it couldn't have been a modern forgery because of the way it's positioned on the rock. It had to be on the stone before the stone was put in place. And there have been alternative Egyptologists who otherwise had previously supported the 10,000 BC idea, like Graham Hancock and Robert Bauval, who have been able to, like Graham Hancock was able to spend a whole day in the relieving chambers looking at stuff, and he had to reverse his position and said, this is authentic, this is not a forgery. And so he revised his 10,000 BC date and acknowledged that work was being done on the Great Pyramid during Khufu's reign. So I think that's what the evidence points to. Also, I find the air shaft idea of these were channels that like were aligned to stars, and the pharaoh's soul would launch to the stars. I find that a really fascinating idea, but it also doesn't fit the data. We've done a lot more research on these air shafts in recent years, and we've even sent robots up into them. You know, previously we could measure the angle they leave the queen's chamber at or the angle they leave the king's chamber at, but what they do after that was unclear. And we've now sent robots up them and filmed them, and they turn and twist around. And so they're not just straight out. And so that means they weren't just straight line alignments to some star. They're bending around other internal features in the pyramid, and so that would discount them from being star shafts and being aligned with particular stars, because they're apparently not built to give the pharaoh's soul a straight shot to the stars. They're just air shafts.
Yep. Yeah. And is there anything robots can't help with? Don, thanks very much for that question. It's interesting to
world domination. I don't want them helping with that.
Oh, all right. All right, Jimmy, you got to set limits, I guess. To me, Jimmy, it is possible that the patriarchs saw these pyramids, right?
Very much so. I mean, because these, the Giza pyramids date to 2500 BC and a little bit after. Abraham depending on the dating system you think, wouldn't have lived until 2000 or 1800 BC. And so when he and the later patriarchs go to Egypt, yeah, they would have seen these pyramids.
That's wild. Wild to think about it. Don, thanks for the question. We got to take a break. We'll be right back with more Internet Open Forum with Jimmy Akin right after this.
Miss a show? Make sure to catch up by downloading the podcast, available online at Catholic.com.
Underwriting for Catholic Answers Live is provided by Real Estate for Life. Real Estate for Life connects homebuyers and sellers to real estate agents while supporting pro-life organizations. On the web at realestateforlife.org.
Each week on The World Over, Raymond Arroyo challenges listeners and viewers with important political and cultural reporting and analysis of a wide variety of topics of interest to Catholics and people of faith. And you can get news from the world over in your inbox every week. It's easy. Visit EWTN.com and click subscribe. EWTN, the Global Catholic Network.
Welcome back. Catholic Answers Live. Thanks so much for being here with us. We'd like to have a little bit of fun on Fridays. It's always fun to have Jimmy here, and it's always fun to get to do the Internet Open Forums. You get all kinds of interesting questions from the Internet. I mean, we get a lot of interesting questions from the calls too, but it's fun to be able to organize the Internet questions and pick out those ones that really pique our interest. And this one comes from Elaine. She asked this, Jimmy, what's the best way to talk to people who just don't see anything good about what the church teaches?
Well, obviously you want to be polite, but the next thing I would do is ask them questions about what it is they don't like about church teaching, because that can vary widely from one person to another. I'd also try to point out things that they would approve of that the church teaches. Like, for example, according to the Catholic Church, the two great commandments, the two big priorities for God are love of God and love of neighbor. And unless you're an anti-love person, you probably could acknowledge that those are good things. Depending on if the person is another Christian, you can point out the church teaches that Jesus Christ is God incarnate and he saved us from our sins by dying for us on the cross. And, we don't earn our salvation. It's a gift from God. You can point out things that, would appeal to the individual person. But the way to know which things you need to discuss with the person is by asking them questions. What do they believe? So that you want a sketch of their own belief system. And then what is it about the Catholic Church that they find that they find disturbing? What are their objections? And then you can work on those individually and try to point out things that they would agree with that the church also teaches.
Thanks very much for that.
And of course, be nice.
I guess, yeah. All right. Thanks, Elaine. Jeff asks this. I've been in a few debates about limbo. Does it exist, and do unbaptized children go there? So many different thoughts on this from many different theologians.
Well, so I don't know whether limbo exists. The current state of doctrinal development on limbo is that it is not necessary for limbo to exist. So I should explain what limbo we're talking about. We're talking about the limbo of the infants. And this is an idea that was proposed in the Middle Ages to resolve a dilemma of what happens to unbaptized children who die in infancy. Because they are unbaptized, they wouldn't have, and also they wouldn't have the desire of the sacraments because they're infants. They wouldn't have the sanctifying grace needed to be united with God. On the other hand, because they're infants, they haven't committed any sins. They're not at an age where they can be responsible for their behavior. And so they haven't committed any sins that would warrant punishment in the afterlife. And so there's a question about, well, what would their fate be? It looks like they wouldn't be united with God, but they also shouldn't be punished. And the idea developed that, well, maybe they go to a place where they don't suffer because they haven't sinned, but they also aren't in the full glory of heaven. It might be, this is one of the speculations, it might be a place of great natural joy, not the full joy of being with God. And for a number of centuries, this was the common view, and it was a non-infallible teaching of the church in some periods. But more recently, there's been a reevaluation of this. The Second Vatican Council taught that God offers every person, even if it's in a mysterious way that we can't perceive or don't understand, he offers every person the possibility of salvation. And if that's true, that would include infants who die without baptism. So there are different ways that God might offer such children the possibility of salvation. And as a result of reflection on this, the Catechism, when it came out in 1992, said that we may hope that the church prays for these infants, and we may hope for their salvation. And then during the reign of Pope Benedict, the International Theological Commission did a study on this question and concluded that although limbo is still a theological possibility that people can still believe in, there are other legitimate options as well, and so limbo is not a required belief at this point. So it's an ambiguous issue. You can make up your own mind about it. Before doing that, though, I would suggest reading the International Theological Commission's document. It's called something like On the Fate of Children Dying Without Baptism. So if you Google International Theological Commission children or infants and baptism, it should come up.
Thanks, Jeff. Appreciate that question. This one comes from Ray. Ray says this: is the Latin Mass evil, good, or wonderful? And why does Francis hate it so much?
Well, I actually don't have any evidence that Pope Francis hates and by Latin Mass, we're talking about the traditional Latin Mass. I don't have any evidence that Pope Francis hates it. He grew up with it. What he finds problematic is the attitudes of some of the people who attend the traditional Latin Mass, because in his document where he imposed some restrictions on the celebration of the traditional Latin Mass, that's what he was concerned about. It was people who were identifying themselves with the Latin Mass and saying Vatican II isn't a valid council, and they're opposing the recent popes and things like that. And it was really to address those bad attitudes that he decided to impose restrictions. If the people at the Latin Mass were going, yay, Vatican II, yay, recent popes, this wouldn't have happened. So it's not that he hates the Latin Mass, it's that he doesn't want to encourage anti-Vatican II, anti-papal attitudes by creating centers where people can get together and foster those attitudes and kind of, bubble with resentment against Vatican II and the Pope. So he's trying to stop those ideas from spreading. It's not the Mass itself that's the problem. In terms of considering the Mass itself, well, it brings Christ to us, and that makes it wonderful.
Yeah.
Just like all the other rites of Mass that the Church has used, including the current one and including the ones in the Eastern rites and including historical ones here in the West. Anything that brings Christ to you is wonderful. That doesn't mean it's perfect or couldn't be made better, but it is in and of itself wonderful.
Ray, thank you very much for that question. Appreciate it. It's Internet Open Forum. Jimmy Akin is our guest, and this one comes from Stephen. Stephen said, well, first of all, he prefaces it by saying, no joke question. All right, so he's serious about this question. How would you answer an atheist regard the problem of unresistant unbelief? If a fella says he wants to believe in God and be a Christian, as one famous atheist YouTuber said recently, but just needs some confirming sign to push him over the hump, what explanation can we give for why God refrains from doing so? Or is there some other reply?
Well, I would tend to reply in another way. I would tend to say, well, And it's going to depend on from person to person. But if someone is in the position of, I want to believe, but I find it difficult, I would say, well, let's take a look at some of the evidence for God's existence or for the Christian faith. And if the evidence isn't enough to convince you, then I would say let's apply Pascal's wager. It's in your interest to be a Christian compared to being a materialist atheist. And so I would say you have practical reasons to believe. If you don't find the evidential ones fully convincing, the practical reasons would also point you in that direction. And then it's a part of following Pascal's advice. Start living as a Christian, because Pascal deals with this in his Pensées, and says, take masses or take holy water and have masses said and just live as a Christian, assume it's true, and gradually you won't have the problem anymore.
Stephen, there's the music, so we got to take a break. Thank you very much for the question. Lots and lots of great questions to come. It's Internet Open Forum. Jimmy Akin is our guest. Catholic Answers Live, right back.
Here's a question. Is it really possible to be friends with someone who died 2,000 years ago? Maybe the problem is that we've grown way too comfortable with the story of Jesus. Nice man, right? Taught us to love one another, said not to judge people. We celebrate his birthday every year. It's time to put away this small, safe version of Jesus, says Cy Kellett. Nobody that bland could have transformed the world. In A Teacher of Strange Things, Cy presents Jesus Christ undiluted by sentiment, with all his radical words and deeds uncensored. Do you know someone, your son or daughter perhaps, or maybe your mom or dad, who needs the friendship of Jesus Christ? Do you? Order your copy of A Teacher of Strange Things by visiting shop.catholic.com today or asking for it at a good Catholic bookstore near you. Have you enrolled in the Catholic Answers School of Apologetics? Let me ask you a more important question. Do you believe as a Catholic that you have an obligation to share the Catholic faith? In fact, the Church has answered this question, and the answer is that all confirmed Catholics are obliged to share the faith. It's actually in canon law. Catholic Answers is here to help you fulfill that obligation. Our School of Apologetics courses will equip you to help all the people you come in contact with understand what the Church teaches and why. A great place to start is with all the Catholics in your life. Learn the art of apologetics from the best of the best and start sharing the gospel today. Visit schoolofapologetics.com. That's schoolofapologetics.com.
Did you know you can access Catholic Answers Live right from your phone or other mobile device? Download the Catholic Answers Live app today. The Catholic Answers Live app, available now on iOS and Android.
Welcome back to Catholic Answers Live. Hope your Friday is going well. I hope your September is going well. Just started September. I hope it's going well for you. This one, you just don't get questions like this for the other apologists. Logan asked this: how is it possible that when a semi-trailer is carrying a bunch of honeybee hives, that a honeybee can fly outside of the hive and just hover right there while the truck is moving 75 miles an hour, and the honeybee doesn't get left behind? This blows my mind. I need Jimmy's help.
Okay, so I don't know of cases of this happening at 75 miles an hour, but assuming that's true, I can explain the principles that are involved. The first one involves relative motion. And a good way to understand this is by thinking about what happens if you are on a train, or if you are riding on a flatbed truck, or if you're riding in a cargo truck in the cargo area where you can stand up. There is at whatever speed you're traveling, whether it's 75 miles an hour or something else, you have the same forward motion that the truck does, because you accelerated as the truck got up to speed. And as a result, you have inertia. So imagine you're on a train or a flatbed truck, or you're in a cargo truck, in the cargo container of a truck, and you leap up. Why doesn't it happen that the moment your feet come off the ground, you fly backwards?
Right.
Well, the answer is because you have inertia. You have the same inertia that the truck did. This is why, like when you're in a car or an airplane and you're sitting in your chair and it starts to accelerate, you get pushed back, because you don't have the forward momentum that the airplane or car does. And so that pushes you back in your seat. And as long as you're accelerating, as long as the vehicle is picking up speed, you're gonna feel a backward force. But when the vehicle stops accelerating and is traveling at a constant speed, you then don't have that backwards force, because now you're traveling forward at the same rate as the vehicle is. And so when you jump, you retain that inertia and you continue to go forward. Before you jumped, you were going forward at 75 miles an hour. And as you jump, you're still going forward at 75 miles an hour. And so that's why you don't fly off the back of the truck or slam into the back of the cargo container, is because you still have that forward momentum of 75 miles an hour. Well, if you have bees on the back of a flatbed truck that is going 75 miles an hour, they have that forward momentum too. They acquired it as the truck accelerated up to 75 miles an hour. And so they can fly around their own beehive. They could fly off the truck and come back, because they're all still going 75 miles an hour forward. They're not going to be left behind. What is a complicating factor, though, is wind, because as the truck is moving forward, it's moving through the air. And the air, all things being equal, is not going to be moving in the same direction as the truck. So in principle, the air is going to be moved where it is, standing still, and with the truck moving through it at 75 miles an hour, it will create the appearance of a wind that's blowing backwards at 75 miles an hour. And that is something that a bumblebee in this situation is going to have to compensate for. So it is moving forward at this rate, but it's going to, when it flies off the truck, it's going to encounter wind that's going backwards at this other rate. Per Isaac Newton's every action has an equal and opposite reaction. And so it's going to need to fly forward in such a way to compensate for that wind. And that's why I say I don't know that this would really happen at 75 miles an hour. I don't know that bumblebees can fly fast enough to compensate for that. But at lower speeds, they could. At lower speeds, if it's, going, 10 miles an hour or something, a bumblebee could probably compensate for that. But that's a general sketch of the physics involved. The bumblebees, like the truck, the bumblebees will have the same forward speed as the truck. And all they'll need to compensate for is the countervailing wind.
All right. I'm really glad we got a bumblebee question in, Logan. Thanks. Thanks very much for that. All right. This next one comes from Bennett. And Bennett asks this: I know it is illicit for someone like a grandparent to baptize a child in secret against both parents' wishes and against their priest's decision, even though my understanding is valid. My question is, did the child ultimately benefit from this? If yes, why is it considered illicit? If no, how come? And then he asks, was it just neutral?
Okay, well, it is against church law to baptize someone without the consent of either themselves or their guardians, which is the parents in this case. You need the permission of at least one of the parents or the people who take their place to baptize an infant. Does the infant benefit from being baptized? Yes. He receives God's grace. It is a valid baptism, as you say. He receives God's grace, and thus he benefits from it, at least for now. If he's then completely not raised a Christian, he can easily lose the benefit that he got from it, and could even end up, at least this has been an argument of some theologians historically, could end up worse off. Like, for example, Tertullian in around AD 200 argued that infants should not be baptized on the grounds they might not keep the promises that were made on their behalf as Christians and end up in a worse state rather than a better one. I'm not sold on that as an argument, but it's an argument that's been proposed. In terms of, taking it for granted that the child benefits, at least for now, why wouldn't this be licit to do? Well, because the ends do not justify the means. And so you have a good end of helping the child, but under ordinary situations, the children are, by natural law, under the authority of their parents. And since they're not capable at this age of making their own religious decisions, it falls to their parents to make religious decisions on the part of the child. And the church wants to respect that. And so it forbids people outside of danger of death from baptizing children without the consent of the parents. Now, in danger of death, it's a different matter. In danger of death, the church says, yes, baptize the child right away, whether the parents want it or not. So the church is trying to strike a balance here between the needs of the child, which are the need for baptism is greater if the child is in danger of death, but also respect the natural law rights of the parents. And so it recognizes that parents have a right to make decisions for their children, but that the right is not absolute, and an emergency circumstance can override the parental rights.
Bennett, thank you very, very much for that question. That brings us to the obvious next question. Do vampires have souls? I don't know. It's not that obvious. Paul, he asked that. Do vampires have souls, Jimmy? Is it murder to slay a vampire, assuming the classical undead form?
Well, so it's good that Paul included that we're assuming the classical undead form, because there are different kinds of vampires in vampire literature. And in some cases, they would be alive and would have souls, and it would be murder to kill them. They would just, be people who, let's say, have an infection that causes them to need to drink human blood. And you can't kill someone just because they have a dangerous infection. In fact, vampire lore is likely significantly based on a couple of medical conditions. One of them is porphyria, and another is rabies. And both porphyria and rabies cause their victims to display characteristics that are associated with vampirism. Also, in the case of rabies, with werewolfism or lycanthropy. Well, you can't kill someone just because they have porphyria, and you can't kill someone just because they have rabies. But Paul says we're assuming the classic undead form. Okay. What does that mean? I know, like, if you watch Bela Lugosi movies, they use terms like undead, but what does that mean? And I don't. The soul is what animates a living organism, and so anything that's alive would have soul. Here we're saying they're not alive, they're undead, but we're also not saying they're fully dead either, because they're animate, and animate things have souls. That's even the Latin word for soul, anima. It's what animates you. And vampires are clearly animated. They move around, they do stuff. So I would say that if you assume that vampires are undead, the question of whether they have a soul is going to depend on whether they are, I think we have to further dig into the concept of what does being undead mean. It may turn out that they have a soul. It may turn out that something else is animating them. If it's not a soul that's animating them, I would want to know what it is. I could imagine, for example, it might be like in the movie Plan 9 from Outer Space, where there are zombies that are Earth people who have died, and they have had an electrical device shot into the pineal pituitary glands in their heads, and somehow that reanimates them. So basically, they're just walking corpses that are mechanically reanimated. And if that's what vampires are, then they wouldn't have a soul, and it wouldn't be murder to slay one. Also, if a non-human spirit, like a demon or something, was what was animating a vampire, well, then it wouldn't have a soul, and you could exorcise it or you could slay it without it being murder. But if they are alive, and then it looks like to me like they've got a soul, and on the precautionary principle, you should not simply kill them until such time as they become a threat to other people, at which point stake them through the heart.
Finally, a definitive answer there at the end. Hey, thanks very much for the question, Paul. We got to take a quick break. Right back with more Open Forum with Jimmy Akin right after this.
There's only one Catholic Answers Live.
We have a big problem. Our culture is dying, and souls are in danger of being lost. The answer is conversion to Jesus Christ in His church. St. Paul Street Evangelization is a Catholic organization, and we have hundreds of teams spreading the good news throughout the country. But we need your help. The harvest is great, but the laborers are few. Find out more and get involved today at streetevangelization.com. That's streetevangelization.com.
Hi, I'm Janet Williams, and I want to invite you to join me at the EWTN Family Celebration in Phoenix. I'm looking forward to seeing you.
Make your plans now to attend the EWTN Family Celebration October 1st at the Phoenix Convention Center in Phoenix, Arizona. Find out how you can be a part at EWTN.com/family celebration.
Welcome back to Catholic Answers Live. I'm Cy Kellett, your host. Having some fun on a Friday with Jimmy Akin with an internet open forum. All of these questions have come to Jimmy from the internet, and I get the pleasure of reading them and hearing the answers. And this one comes from David. David says, what do you think of AI-created art, Midjourney, etc.? I used to think there could be a Turing test equivalent. That is, that we'd always be able to tell the difference between computer-generated images and human-created art. But as I see what is being created by Midjourney and the like, I'm having doubts.
Yeah, so Midjourney is an artificial intelligence or AI application that is, I guess it's currently in beta testing or something, but there are lots of public users. Like if you have a Discord account, you can apply to use Midjourney. And what you do, my understanding, is you type in a description of the art that you want. Like you could, for example, say you want a picture of a robot eating a taco, and then Midjourney will come up with one for you. And in looking at some of the art that Midjourney has produced, it is very impressive. I would not know that this was created by an AI if I were not told. So I think that at least currently, at least from what I have seen, and I haven't probed Midjourney and tried to test it, but from what I have seen, I would say it's already passing the Turing art test. In part because there has been previous AI art which would come out bizarre looking. Midjourney, at least from what I saw, is not particularly bizarre looking, but then that's not really a huge help to us because there are lots of humans in the 20th century that produced bizarre looking art. Anti-realism and surrealism were big phases in 20th century art, and they still exist today as artistic styles. So I would say that I think it already is hard to tell computer-generated art from regular art, at least just by looking at it. There might be a way you could examine it pixel by pixel and find patterns in the way it's arranged the pixels that no human would use. But at least by Mark I eyeball inspection, I think it's already hard and will be increasingly hard to tell computer-generated art from human-generated art. Oh, we also, by the way, if you're interested in artificial intelligence, we just recorded a Catholic Answers Focus episode on AI, and it just released this last Wednesday, is my understanding.
Yeah, and we'll get into that Turing test and just what it means. Does it do what it claims to do? And then also we'll talk about some of the dangers of AI, and can AI really have human equivalent intelligence? So yeah, just CatholicAnswersFocus.com is the place to go.
It's also, that particular episode is also a lot of fun. You might not think it, but there's a lot of fun stuff in that episode.
I truly think I laughed more during that than I ever laughed during any Focus. I think it's the funniest time. It just came out that I didn't expect it, Jimmy, but you caught me off guard with some stuff on artificial intelligence. So I hope people will enjoy it. All right, let's go on. This one comes from Matt. Is there a distinction? Okay, so he's giving a list here. Is there a distinction between hell, Hades, Gehenna, Sheol, lake of fire, or are they all the same thing?
Okay, so there are some differences in these terms. I'm going to save hell for last because hell is an English term. Hades, or Hades, is a Greek term, and it just refers to the place of the dead. It does not refer specifically to the place of the damned. So all of the dead, or at least many of the dead, go to Hades, or Hades. Sheol is sort of the same thing. Sheol is a Hebrew word. Some people want to say it's Sheol, but that is wrong. It is Sheol. Sheol is, it's sometimes translated the grave. That's probably a little too definite. Sheol really is the place of the dead. And again, there is no distinction between the place of the saved and the place of the damned. Sheol is where everybody goes in ancient Jewish thought. So Sheol and Hades are synonyms. They both refer to the place of the dead. Hades, or Hades, does that in Greek. Sheol does that in Hebrew. We then have Gehenna and the lake of fire. Gehenna is another name for the valley of Hinnom, which is a valley that is between Jerusalem and the Mount of Olives. And one of the things that happened in Gehenna was they would burn trash there. They also, during a certain period of Israel's history, burned children there. There was a ritual site in the valley of Hinnom called the Tophet, and you could apparently see the Tophet from the temple because the Temple Mount is opposite the Mount of Olives, and so you've got the valley of Hinnom, or Gehenna, between them. And the prophets, talk about how you could see the Tophet from the temple. And with the garbage burning and the child burning, Gehenna got a really bad reputation, and it was considered a bad place. And so you have Jesus using it as a symbol of eternal perdition, or the bad place, the place of the damned. In the book of Revelation, you have the same place, the place of condemnation, the place of the damned, pictured as a lake of fire. And at least from what we can tell, it looks like Gehenna and the lake of fire are basically the same thing. They're both the place of the damned. They're just being pictured differently. A different image is being used. Jesus is using one image, John is using another image, but they're both the place of the damned. Then we get to the last word, hell. Hell is an English word, and it comes from German roots. And originally, in English and in German, it just meant the place of the dead. So it was a synonym for Hades, or Hades, and Sheol. It did not specifically mean the place of the damned. And you still see this usage in English when we recite the Creed, and we say that Jesus descended into hell. we do not mean he descended to the place of the damned. We just mean he died. He went to the place of the dead. And so even though that's not how we use the word in contemporary English, that's what it originally meant and what it still means in the Creed. However, it has acquired a second meaning in English, which is the place of the damned. And when it's used this way, it's a synonym for Gehenna and the lake of fire. It may not be pictured exactly the same way in art. It may or may not, but it has these two uses. Historically, hell meant the place of the dead, but in colloquial contemporary English, it means the place of the damned.
Thank you very much. The end. Yeah, I have never had someone just list them all and ask for the distinctions. So Matt, thank you very, very much for that one. This one comes from Rob, and Rob says, why is sex outside of marriage sinful? This seems to be an overwhelming reality.
Well, sex outside of marriage is sinful because humans are not sea turtles. Sea turtles breed, and then the females go up on the beach and they dig a hole and they lay their eggs and then they cover them up. And then they go away and don't ever interact with their offspring again. And eventually the eggs hatch, they're warmed by the sun, buried in the sand, and they hatch, and the baby sea turtles are on their own. And they crawl towards the sea, and they try to swim away before predators get them, and then they try to grow up and become big sea turtles, and then they get to spawn. Well, that's not how it works with humans. Humans have super big brains, and as a result, our infants have super big heads compared to other animals. And as a result, this caused a problem when humans began to walk upright. Walking upright forces your pelvic bone to take on a certain shape. And that meant that that human babies with their big heads had a problem coming out of the womb. And so the evolutionary solution was they need to be born prematurely compared to other animals. You look at other animals, and like baby horses, they can get up and run within a few minutes. Human babies can't crawl for months and months. Human babies are born way prematurely compared to other creatures because their head needs to be small enough and undeveloped enough to be able to fit through the opening in the pelvic bone and be born. And so as a result, human babies, unlike the babies of other animals, are way dependent on their parents. They need constant care when they are little infants, and frankly, they need to be cared for their parents for years, for virtually 2 decades. Yeah. And so that means unless you're going to shove all of the load onto the mom, that means the dad needs to be around. And of course, the dad needs incentive to be around. And so that's one of the reasons that human females are sexually receptive all the time instead of just during mating season, because evolutionarily that's incentive for the man to stick around. Also, the marriage helps the two spouses because they're combining their labors and they're caring for their offspring. And this needs to be a stable situation that will last for decades in order for them to raise their children. And so as a result of us not being sea turtles, we need to have marriage. And if you engage in sexual activity outside of marriage, you are running the risk of having a baby outside of marriage that will not be raised with the advantages of marriage. And you don't have other good options, like you don't want to kill the baby. Abortion and infanticide are murder. And so the basic design of human beings is such that we need to form decades-long, or in historical terms, lifelong unions of men and women as husband and wife in order to care for each other and to care for the offspring that are going to be born super dependent on the parents and take decades to grow up.
You're not sea turtles. Act like it. Jimmy, thanks very much. I really enjoyed that 2 hours, and I really enjoyed our focus conversation that we got to have that came out on Wednesday. So I hope people will look into that. Have a great weekend, Jimmy. We'll see you next week.
Thanks. You too.
All right. That does it for us. We'll see you next time, God willing, right here on Catholic Answers Live.